On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Jim Olsen. He's the CTO at ModelOp. We're going to be talking about AI governance. And what do I mean by that? Well, there is a process of bringing a foundational model into an organization. You have to understand where the AI governance fits, the importance of it. There's a lot of rules and regulations that you have to be aware of, and those don't always move very fast. Also, performance towards business outcome. I think that's a key one we're going to be talking about. Jim, thanks for joining the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on today. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Before we start, can you tell the audience what ModelOp does?
Sure, exactly what you said. Basically, the governance of all kinds of models, which is, of course, inclusive of both foundational LLM models, but also overall RAG implementations and solutions that utilize those foundational models to achieve a business need. And we really handle that whole process from everything from understanding where models are deployed, what components make up a model, and then moving it through the business and tracking that the appropriate steps have been done so that you both can comply with not only maybe regulatory compliance, but also your own internal quality requirements as well, because nobody wants a model hurting their business. So you need to cover that as well.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure you're being kept busy with all the innovation and progress everyone is seeing out there within the AI space. I guess let's start at the top. A company wants to leverage some type of AI solution. They may not want to build their own. They might want to leverage an existing foundational model. They need to incorporate that into the business. Like all technology projects, there is a process. When we're talking about a foundational model in a company that is interested in leveraging it, what does the process look like? Because obviously a lot of people are probably familiar with technology projects or initiatives, and this might not be exactly the same.
Yeah, well, a lot of that comes down to what their business goal is. The most common thing we're seeing being adopted within enterprise organizations today is kind of really two different business use cases. One being the traditional RAG kind of chatbot. I mean, that's the common one. You've got things like Microsoft Copilots or ChatGPTs or, all these kind of already canned solutions where they can do this rapidly, or they can implement it through LangChain code themselves and have their own agents and guardrails within it. But the other interesting one we're seeing as well is using it for summarization. So, for example, like a new prospectus comes out within a financial organization and you want to act on it fast. Can an LLM summarize that for you accurately and give you that advantage of being able to distill that information down to the pertinent points you care about for making an investing decision? So we're seeing those kinds of things. So people are evaluating the different foundational models in respect to what they're doing. A lot are just starting with the kind of out of the box, like Copilots or something like that, because they have a Microsoft contract and bring that in. So they're not doing a lot of analysis on the foundational model itself, but instead the overall business outcome. Like how is it performing at that RAG solution? And you see the same thing with the summarizations, except I see a lot more self-hosted models in those cases, because you can run a smaller model in that case because they're just doing summarization and get good results. So they're about taking multiples of those different self-hosted models, whether it being like Orca or Llama or any of the other smaller models that you can run in-house, and running them through their paces and seeing what they get results. And a lot of it is gut feel at this point, because there's not a ton of great measures out there. So it is still kind of that art, and that's where we're trying to bring some things in to help with that overall process.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned, obviously, there's not a lot, and a lot of it is relying on other experiences, gut feel, intuition. When you're looking at the term AI governance, I think actually it'd be good to define what that actually means, because I think most of the audience should have heard about data governance. Maybe they haven't heard about AI governance. What does AI governance mean in this case?
Well, AI governance as a whole stands kind of on, in our opinion, three pillars. First, you have to know what you have. If you don't know what's in your company, you can't even start. So, there's the inventory component that actually catalogs in detail what models, what makes up a model. Like, okay, which vendor models are you using? Are you using GPT-4? Are you using Microsoft Copilot? Or are you using whatever? And then what's the code associated with that goes out. So you need a robust inventory to actually track what's being deployed and what's getting out there and where it's being used in the organization. How many solutions use GPT-4 in your company? You might want to know that, when you get into these things. And then there's the actual process through which a model should go. The golden standard of model governance, not just AI governance, is what is referred to as SR 11.7, and that's been used for quite a while within the financial community. So what you see is very regimented steps where, like, for instance, you have things like the model developers develop the model, but they can't be the ones to review the model. It needs to be another group that reviews to do that. And how do you orchestrate that process? And ideally, it starts with a use case and actually assessing a risk to the use case before you even build anything, before you decide if you should use an LLM to do this. You got to start with what business risk is there. And then managing that process all the way through, automating that process is ideal, and that's what we do. And ongoing monitoring. Is the model drifting? Is it not performing correctly? If you do detect these exceptions, what happens? Do you file an exception report and determine whether you can keep using this model? And eventual retirement. All models have a shelf life. They need to be retired. So, you need to pull them out of service and understand that you need a replacement, and that it's time to maybe either refresh that model or recertify the model, or all these. These are all aspects of model governance, and they just ensure that two things. One, there's the regulatory compliance side. Nobody really likes that as much. That's what you have to do. And big banks do that. But then there's also the risk to your business. You don't want these things going wrong if they're making business decisions. You don't want it to start discriminating against a protected class, as an example. That's going to hurt your bottom line, and should, frankly, when it comes to those kinds of things. So governance as a whole isn't just regulations. It's also making sure that you're both assessing and managing the risk of the models that can occur to your business.
As you're mentioning this, I was thinking about a couple things. One, obviously, as you stated, it's still early days, and we've spent 20, 30, 40, 50 years dealing with data and data solutions and data governance and data quality. Those things are, they're well known. I think people may not execute on them ideally, but they're well known. We know what those issues are. When it comes to AI governance, being new, not being fully aware of the impact of a solution, at least not thinking through the whole life cycle, because it is, maybe the company doesn't have that capability yet, or they haven't seen the life cycle of a Gen AI solution through long enough. When you think about that and where AI governance sits in, it almost seems like this safeguard is a bit of a, hey, the guardrails need to be, well, I mean, I guess depending on what you want the guardrails to be, these guardrails are essential because we're kind of diving into the unknown a bit.
Yeah, well, there's the guardrails that are the real-time interactivity of stopping you from doing something like swearing at your clients or something like that. I mean, those are obvious and relatively easy, and I think those are well understood. But what's not as well understood is, how well is it doing for your company? And we see this across all models. I mean, traditional like predictor models and categorical models and things like that are a little easier to measure, so that those are understood. But the process is always we're still put in place. Think of it as like the early days of coding before we had DevOps. You kind of build it, you just deploy it right off your desk, away you go. Now, of course, every organization has a large number of steps you go through in order to bring a coded solution out there. Models have their own unique capability, whether it be an AI model, an ML model, or even just an Excel spreadsheet. If it's doing automated process within your business, so it's making real-time predictions that affect outcomes, we haven't traditionally managed that as well. And that's where the whole idea of governance needs to come in. You can think of it as like DevOps for the AI world, where we want processes in place to make sure the quality is there and the monitoring is there, because unlike code is pretty followed path until it gets some weird input it's never seen before and maybe just crashes, and that's pretty obvious. Models can start making what valid, quote unquote, predictions about business decisions, yet they're bad decisions. So we need that ability to detect, is it putting out bad language, is it making bad suggestions? It could not even be toxic. A guardrail can't protect against this, but if it's giving bad financial advice to your client, in the case of a financial institution, that's not going to be good, and it's a lot more esoteric to pick that up. So that's why you need those kinds of, not live stop it right now, that's really hard to do, but at least looking back over some quanta of time with recency, depending on the amount of data quantity you have, and determining it's meeting your business use case well. And that kind of things. And there's some techniques for that. There's not a lot there yet. I think we'll see more and more evolving. And that's a very important space to be in. And I think that's what's really in its infancy, is how well is your AI solution performing for your business?
Interesting, because you mentioned automation, and obviously people have processes that have been running for a very long time. So there's a human in the loop. There's a human doing the work. And there's checks and balances built along that way through historical processes, and we're aware of what to look for, what to not look for. When it comes to an AI solution where you're like, well, I might have a human in the loop, I might not have a human in the loop, there's rules and regulations. As you're looking at AI governance and looking at rules and regulations, and as rules and regulations change, talk about how those potentially affect the model and the governance, because obviously when a rule does change, you've actually trained the model on a certain amount of data, it understands things, you have to go back and potentially adjust things because there are different parameters based on rules and regulations if you're in that type of industry. How does AI governance help there?
Well, first of all, again, the simple thing of inventory, a new thing comes up about using LLMs. You now know every single model out there that you have as an implementation that uses an LLM. So you've covered like a huge part of the mountain climb right there, is identifying who is using what in business predictions that are exposed to externally or whatever the regulation is, and you can determine that very quickly. So that's very important. But then you can also go back, and again, that's why the robust inventory is important, is understand what kinds of data it's actually dealing with. Now, this is really tricky with LLMs. I don't know an LLM out there. I mean, there's a few open source ones that discloses their full data set. So how do you guarantee that any LLM doesn't contain some GDPR data, as an example? So something that was supposed to have been rescinded via the EU regulations, but in fact it's in there. And those are what we refer to as vendor models. There's not a lot about you as an individual you can do. You need to get protection from your vendor against that. And they need to be doing that internally, since you don't have that data. But likewise, if you're in a RAG solution, you need to have the reference to those documents that are in there, and make sure that, for like a data privacy is the simplest example, that you did actually, you aren't having any data that was rescinded or otherwise asked to be scrubbed, and or prove that you followed the due diligence steps, like in the EU Act, et cetera. You actually have to file reports with the EU saying how you're using it, if you're doing certain things, like if you're making health predictions or you're doing that. We're seeing that some states in the US too have passed things specifically about health, like saying, these LMs cannot be used to make health decisions unless there's a human in the loop who makes the ultimate decision. And even then there's different levels of that. So you need to be able to prove that that was done if you were ever audited or there's any question on there. And that's where a governance process, where you can go back and show, yes, I did do all these steps to the best of my ability. It went bad. Technology goes bad. This happens, but look, we tried our best and I can prove it to you. And I think that's what most regulations are really trying to enact, not come down and wait for you to slip up and jump on you, but trying to make sure that you have good processes in place.
I think that's a very interesting aspect that people are going to start having to pay attention to, because obviously as you mentioned, this is a new solution for a lot of people. And I think early on, obviously we're all kind of using intuition, and we're picking low-hanging fruit. As you mentioned, chatbots. I mean, certain things can go wrong, but there's also limitations of what can go wrong as it gets further into the company. That's going to be really interesting to kind of follow. One thing you'd mentioned that I definitely wanted to make sure we had time to cover was performance towards the business outcome. Obviously, this is all predicated on, we've identified a business need and identified what we are hoping for a business outcome.
Yeah, well,
obviously,
hopefully you do that before you start building something, ideally.
well, we've been in technology long enough to know that's not always the case. It's sometimes misguided intentions. It's actually interesting. On a side note, I've been asking a lot of people about, especially engineers and technologists, when they listen to the business problem on the upfront discussion with business people, how quickly we all start modeling solutions in our minds. It's like you can't turn it off. It's always ever present. That's how I was. I mean, maybe it's more of a me thing, but it was interesting because I think a lot of times we start drifting into that world and we're trying to model that anyway. So I digress, but and that's, I think, where some of the requirements.
I agree, by the way. So,
yeah,
I don't know. You start to figure it out because that helps you make it real.
Yeah, you're like, oh, I think I could solve it this way because you're figuring out how to take the tools and make it versus listening to that business. Anyway, sorry, I digress. But that's something that's been coming up, and I find it as an interesting point. But when it comes to performance, talk to us a little bit about, and maybe obviously your solution lends itself well to this, but how do we measure that performance? How do we look at that?
Well, there's a series of different things. There's things you want to look at up front, and then there's things where you want to establish a baseline. That's kind of the two things. So in traditional metrics, for instance, something as simple as accuracy, we know how accurate the model is. That's an upfront. There can be a minimum threshold, and away you go. When we start talking about more natural language solutions, and particularly generative AI, where it's more conversational in nature, you have to look at more like things like drift. So what you need to do, and this is where an automated process is extremely important, is establish baselines of data. So for instance, an easy example of this is, like a kind of like sentiment analysis. So basically, any response, whether it's positive or negative in general, that doesn't really tell you anything up front. But if I suddenly see that the sentiment drifting, like it was really kind of neutral, and now all of a sudden it's going really negative or really positive, and we see this change over time, it's a red flag. We need to go look at that. Another simple example is like top parts of speech count. So counting the top 10 nouns emitted, the top 10 adjectives, the top 10 whatever, and getting those counts. And again, establishing a baseline when we've gone through and we played with it and it looks good, we establish that baseline immediately up front, and then we can automate running that on occasion. And again, look for words, like if it's on model governance documents, we built a RAG that lets you query those and ask questions of it. Typically, we do see things like data, governance, fairness is all the top words. So all of a sudden, I started seeing stuff about cars and recipes, and hey, what's going on? It's not germane to it. Another thing we can do is in a RAG solution, you can look at things like source documents that the answers are coming from, because the solutions will report what source documents they use. And then doing what's called an expert cosine similarity between those source documents and the answer, and making sure the vectors are fairly close in nature, so that the information presented is representative of the original source documents, which is ultimately the business goal on that. Or in the case of, I mentioned summarization, where we can use that same technique of expert cosine similarity to make sure that, again, the summarized information is representative of the original things. Then we do simple things like toxicity assessments and gibberish assessments, and do that on an ongoing fashion as well, to make sure it's not hallucinating and saying nonsensical things. So there's a lot of these things that are more business oriented. You'll see a lot of LLMs where they go through like vector clusters and things like that. And that's great if you're training your own LLM, but I don't have a single business user that is training their own LLMs. It's very expensive, and requires a lot. There's some playing with reinforcement learning, but I've never seen anyone actually put that into business. I'm seeing tons doing RAG solutions and summarizations and stuff where they are actually deployed, providing business value. So we need that higher level abstractions to kind of look at those.
Interesting. As a follow-up, and I just, as you're speaking, I was thinking about this. You're seeing this on the ground, and you mentioned obviously not many are going to go build their own solution ground up. They're leveraging, you mentioned early on, Copilot, other similar initiatives. What are you seeing as learning lessons when it comes to AI governance? Because I'm not sure everyone is going to be familiar with it, but what are some of the learning lessons of not understanding the need of having AI governance early?
Well, I mean, it's one of those things. It's like I think you could. I said I draw lots of parallelisms. I've been developing software for a long time, and I really do draw a lot of parallelisms back to the early days of coding, where there was no DevOps solution in place. Nobody would disagree with you in a second that the that some formalized process to get your software out to production wasn't required. I didn't know any engineers. It just didn't feel you had the time for it. You're like, I got too much to do, things like that. And it isn't until you get those calls late at night at 2 a.m. that the system's down and it's a mess because of the item you just pushed out at Friday 8 p.m. and now your whole weekend's ruined. That people are going to start to feel those kinds of pains, and that's when you start to be like, oh yeah, maybe I should have some checks and balances before, because I don't want that call at 2 a.m. So that's more what we're starting to see. Is there's obviously regulated industries where they have to do this, so they're fine. Banks, the big banks, they were some of our earliest customers because they already understood this, and there's real penalties to not doing it. A lot of the customers who are using these solutions aren't necessarily in that kind of a regulated environment, and they're just starting with them, so they haven't gotten those calls at 2 a.m. yet. Or like the one where it was that car dealership that sold a car to somebody with their chat box, they just threw it up there. They had nothing in place clearly to test this thing. So, I think it's going to be there's definitely the regulated industries like the healthcare industry facing those regulations, et cetera, and the banks that always, and large consumer organizations that just have too much to lose if something goes wrong. They have that big feeling right now. They're doing it. They're not that they realize that this is a must do. As we get down to somewhere, maybe it's not in the central of their business and they haven't felt that pain yet. It's more of a yeah, that would be good to do, but maybe I don't need to right now. I got more to do and that kind of things. But I think we're going to see more and more people realize, just like back in the coding days, I mean, what place doesn't have a proper CI/CD pipeline nowadays? If you're a software shop, everybody does. That wasn't true so many years ago. And we're going to see the same thing with model governance. Everybody's going to want a governance pipeline in place because, yeah, the business risk is just too high.
Interesting, because I think you've mentioned that you've drawn the analogy to DevOps, and obviously, I think most software development, groups have some type of CI/CD, or they're working towards it, or it's a mature process. If you were going to put I'm going to look out 5-10 years, it sounds like we're going to see AI governance proliferate to companies because it is going to be as crucial as DevOps. I mean, as I'm listening to you, I hear, hey, you don't want that surprise call, you don't want that surprise issue. You need to be monitoring these things ahead of time. Is that a fair statement that's where the growth opportunity will lie, and that could be very common for most orgs who are running some type of models?
Well, I mean, we build our whole company around that. So,
well, that's an easy one. That's a T-ball question.
From our standpoint, yeah, we obviously believe, and I believe it needs to be done. It's the best practice because, yeah, you've got to have things in place to understand where your models are. And if you do this stuff by hand, it's literally things don't happen. Or, we've met clients where before we get a formalized process, automated process in place, it can take a year to get a model out from the desktop out to actual production because they have to do the governance, but they do it by hand. So that's why I think as more and more of these things become business critical and right in the flow of doing their business, yeah, it's going to be adoption. But we always say, there's things like SR 11.7 that describe everything you should do. We also have what we call minimum viable governance, which is what's the minimum you have to do to really help. And then you can grow on it and add the steps as they make sense to your business and things like that. So, just like you mentioned, in DevOps, there are people along the continuum of journeys and that kind of things. Not every place has like 3 staging environments and and all this stuff, or A/B testing or all that kind of thing. But they probably do at least have a Jenkins build and running some unit tests and things like that. Same thing with governance. You can do some simple steps up front, like I said, just getting them into the inventory so you know where they are and who's using what and what's deployed, and running some very simple monitoring on them on occasion. It's probably enough to start and get you a long ways towards there and that kind of thing. And that's where you still need to automate that and have a system that does that. But, that's what we refer to as that kind of idea of a minimum viable governance.
Fair. I expected it to have been obviously core of what the company's doing, but I think just as you were delineating between some of this stuff being manual and having that minimal viable AI governance layer. And I'm curious, we'll maybe finish the episode out with this question. if you are working with the model right now, and I am just ramping up, we're trying to do things, I might not even be aware that I'm doing a lot of stuff manual because we're just trying to figure stuff out and somebody's just doing what they can. What is the, I guess, that switch to go, I should stop doing this manually? Is there a specific volume? Is it better from day one? Is it a case of, if you're doing a manual just because you guys are finding your way, that's okay? Is there kind of a line in the sand when you should bring in a tool like ModelOp to help with the automation?
Well, I really think that comes down to the criticality to the business. I mean, if you have an internal use model that there's little danger, and the worst you do is offend your internal employees, which still isn't ideal, that's a very different risk than offending a customer or giving them bad advice or making a bad financial decision where it comes in line. So, it's more around how critical are these models to your business. You may have just one model, but your whole business runs on it. I think I'd want to have governance on that thing from day one. And of course, it's always easier to start with having the governance in place and then growing into it than starting with basically a cobbled together process where it's things now you have to come in and fix it because now you're changing the wheels on the tires of a car as it's driving down the road. That's never fun. So, the earlier you bring it in, the better. But the key thing to me is, do you have models, especially AI models, that are making business critical decisions that could have a financial impact on your company? Then I would want that governance in as soon as possible.
Jim, thanks for coming on. I'm sure we haven't exhausted this topic. There's probably plenty of avenues still to explore, and I'm sure people might be hearing about AI governance for the first time. If somebody does want to follow up, what is a good way of connecting with you to kind of speak a little bit further about the subject?
Yeah, first of all, if you go to modelop.com, there's a whole bunch of videos, explanations, demonstrations. We have summits on the topic from some of the industry leaders like FINRA and others on there as well. And then also, if you have personal questions of me, I'm on LinkedIn, just under Jim_Olsen. I think the link will be provided. So you can feel free to reach out through there to me as well.
Okay, awesome, Jim. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Thank you for having me on today.
Absolutely. That's it for the episode. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, thought this was a great conversation because I don't think a lot of people are aware that automating AI governance is a thing and something that they need to be gravitating to. So hopefully that brought a baseline understanding. Please reach out to Jim or ModelOp if you need to learn more, because obviously I think we left a lot uncovered and uncharted. But it's been a great episode to kind of bring some of that initial understandings to everyone out there. So please share the episode with other people. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know how the podcast is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.